You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 376 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Returning to the show is Mike Maharrey. Now, I just had Mike on the show, so everybody know this isn't, just me accidentally running the same audio file again. And it's really a continuation of the saga from the last show, which I thought was incredibly interesting because we had, the Libertarian Party chair going, after Michael for actually going on the, RT network. Well, then it turns out that he rattled some cages even in the U.S. State Department's propaganda wing over at Polygraph.Info, a division of Voice of America. And so this is a really interesting story that we have here. They wrote a debunking article about what he said and everything. So I guess, welcome back to the show. And I think we're going to have a great one for the audience today.
I appreciate it, Kyle. Yeah, this is great. You have a real honest to goodness foreign policy expert on your show today, according to RT.
Yeah, well,
it says so in the headline. I am expert.
Not only according to RT, but Polygraph.Info also said so. I guess according to the U.S. Department of Propaganda, you're also a foreign policy expert.
Well, I guess.
Now, you were just on the show, I think, about a week ago. So maybe you could pick up from the story, because interesting enough, you told me and Will Porter about it not that much longer after we finished recording the last episode of the show. I had you on about SWIFT. So kind of what happened with Polygraph.Info and what were your actions?
Yeah, so we talked about last time my appearance on RT, and basically I just talked about the fact that the United States uses the dollar and along with the SWIFT payment system is kind of a foreign policy billy club. And we also talked a little bit about how certain high-ranking members of the Libertarian Party took me to task a little bit for appearing on that platform when that individual has been on that platform himself, which kind of adds to the amusement of this story because he was like, well, if you have better platforms, you can turn down these lesser platforms. Well, apparently this platform worked out pretty well for me because I think it was the day after we did our interview, I got an email from the folks at Polygraph.Info, which, as you mentioned, is the fact-checking, and I use air quotes around fact-checking, but that's the fact-checking branch of Voice of America, which, of course, is a government-funded, full-fledged propaganda organ of the United States government. And they were asking me if I was accurately quoted in the web article that RT ran based on my interview. Now, of course, I was because I did the interview. They really couldn't take anything that I said out of context because I actually said it live. And so I got this email, and it kind of freaked my wife out a little bit because she's like, "Oh no, the government's coming after us." But so I ciphered on it a little bit, and ultimately I decided that I was not going to respond directly to the folks over at Polygraph.Info because if you read the email, and I actually think I put part of what they said on the initial article that we wrote on TAC, it was pretty contentious. It was clear that they were not in any way, shape, or form going to affirm my position on U.S. foreign policy and economic warfare. And I figured that anything that I said would probably just compound the problem. So I figured it was in my best interest just to ignore them. But I had some conversation with Michael Bolden, who's the executive director over at the 10th Amendment Center, and also Daniel McAdams, who's the executive director over at the Ron Paul Institute for Peace and Liberty, or Peace and Prosperity, RP, yeah. Well, anyway, the Ron Paul Institute. And kind of put our heads together and decided it might not be a bad idea to actually respond to what we figured the polygraph people were going to say. And it wasn't really very hard to determine because I did some Google searching and found some old articles that Polygraph.Info had done on SWIFT, and I knew what their position was. Basically, what they have been saying for years is that the U.S. does not have control over SWIFT, which is technically true. They don't have direct control over it. It's its own organization, and it's actually chartered under EU law. So technically, the EU has control over it legally. And so I knew that was going to be their position. So we wrote a really long article that published on the 10th Amendment Center website, debunking what we figured Polygraph.Info would say. And I did a lot of research on this. I spent probably half a day actually going through various news articles and looking at just how the United States has used the SWIFT system. I've got quotes from high-ranking Treasury officials actually talking about it, people in Congress. So, I mean, there's absolutely no doubt that I'm right about the fact that the United States uses this as a foreign policy tool. So we wrote this, we published it, we got it published before Polygraph.Info came out with their fact check. And the beauty of it was, apparently they're watching now, because when they responded, they actually responded to my pre-rebuttal. So that's what we're going to call the article that I wrote initially that laid all of this out, the pre-rebuttal. And they even linked to it, which is great, and that kind of goes back to this whole thing with Nick Sarwark and platforms. You never know when you get your idea out there how that's going to grow. So I stick by my guns on the fact that I'm going to say what I say every day on any platform that will allow me to say it. But in the Polygraph.Info, it's really funny, and I'll tell you what Daniel McAdams said, because he summed it up perfectly. He said, "Unbelievable. They confirmed everything that you said is true and then pronounced you wrong." And that's exactly what we did. And I assume you'll link to this on the show notes page, the Polygraph.Info article, because when you read it, it confirms that the United States has used SWIFT as a foreign policy tool. And then they say, but we haven't. It's the most bizarre thing in the world. In fact, the little blog I wrote in response, I called it the worst fact check ever, because it really, really is. They confirmed everything that we said, and it's absolutely clear that the United States is using these economic pressures. And, again, like I said, they don't have direct control. They can't demand it, but they can put enough political pressure on the institution that it's going to do what they want them to do. And it has, in fact, done that on repeated occasions. So, my expertise is vindicated and confirmed even by the United States government propaganda arm. So pretty cool stuff.
Yeah. No, so that article really reads like it was written by two people. The first person went through and just wrote down the facts, and then the second person came in and rather than changing any of the facts, just add in at the end of everything so it's not technically true or see how this is wrong, because that's basically what it says. There's no evidence that actually proves that anything you say is incorrect. And please go read that article, because I actually learned things about how the U.S. controlled SWIFT from that article and the links in that artitle.
Yeah. I learned a lot from it too, and from doing the research, because this is well documented. This isn't any kind of conspiracy. I mean, I was very careful when I wrote my initial pre-rebuttal to make sure that I was using sources that would not be tarred as biased by the fact checker. So I used Reuters, I used Bloomberg, I used, I think I might have used the New York Times, and they, I've said this before too, when you start talking about media outlets, they all have their biases. There's no such thing as a completely unbiased outfit. And anybody who thinks that CNBC, CNN, MSNBC, New York Times, Washington Post, anybody that thinks they don't have an agenda and doesn't think that they'll fall in line behind the U.S., the U.S. talking points when the rubber meets the road is absolutely nuts. But I'll read just this one line. This is from the fact check that is supposed to prove me wrong. It says, while the U.S. has the ability to pressure SWIFT thanks to its position in the global economy. And then it goes on and it says it could be limited by potential cost, ... So they said it right here. U.S. has the ability to pressure SWIFT, and we've documented that they do it. And then they avoided a lot of the other stuff that I said in my pre-rebuttal article just by saying, oh, this is beyond the scope of our fact check. Well, what I said was the substance of the fact check. So basically the fact check is beyond the scope of the fact check or something weird like that. Just a totally bizarre attempt. They would have been better off to ignore me. And I've said this before, when it comes to media strategy And I don't know a lot about a lot, but I do have a degree in journalism. I've studied media. I know pretty well how media works. I was told this a long time ago. It's very good wisdom for anybody out there that is in the public eye. You should never argue down. And by that, I mean not argue down by, necessarily if somebody's smarter than you or whatnot, but never argue down as far as somebody that has less reach than you. Because basically you're just giving them a platform. You always try to argue up. You want to take on people that are bigger than you, more well known than you, because then you get to basically subvert their platform. And that's exactly what we did with VOA. If they had been smart, they would have ignored me. But I guess they felt the need. I really believe that this is a narrative that the powers that be really don't want out there. They don't want the American public to realize just how much control the United States exercises over the global economy. And I think they don't want people to know that, because if people start to understand, they'll realize that they are putting their own economy at great risk when they utilize economic power and the dollar position as a weapon. And I think we talked about this a little bit in the last episode. The U.S. is far more vulnerable economically than it is militarily. I'm not worried about China sending troops into Florida, but China could certainly take actions that could wreck the U.S. economy very easily. I mean, just for one example, if they started dumping U.S. treasuries on the market, and they hold trillions of dollars worth of U.S. treasuries, I mean, they could very quickly push up interest rates and make it very difficult for the U.S. to borrow money. And when you're $22 trillion in debt, borrowing money is an important aspect of your government function. So, I think that's why they don't want this narrative out there. They don't want people to know that they use the dollar as a weapon, and they don't want people to understand that it makes them vulnerable. And even though, the U.S. can kick butt militarily, economically, not so much. The U.S. is far more vulnerable.
Right. Well, yeah, I do want to say that I think you're absolutely right that this vindicates you in the criticism that you got from Sarwalk on, that was absolutely worth your time and was a great move to go on RT and to, I think expose probably, if you're a reader of Polygraph.Info and Voice of America, you're just some, true-blooded American that believes that the U.S. government's going to bring you the true news. You got a real lesson there in what SWIFT is about, because of, you going on RT and the events that happened from that. So you're right on that. And then just to say that the word control here, by the definition of like the board of directors, issue a decree within SWIFT and something happens. Yeah, the U.S. can't issue an internal memo. Congress can't pass a bill that changes what, issues a memo within SWIFT to say that this is the new policy. But the Congress or the president can certainly take actions to change and manipulate SWIFT. And in that sense, we are in control of it. And so I think, the point you make is absolutely correct. And it's just that like technical way of looking at that definition is the only argument they really have against, what you're doing there. So, great job on all of this. And is there anything else you have on SWIFT? I mean, this is such an important issue because, while we're looking at the technical details of how the U.S. influences and enforces these sanctions, the real impact is that right now, there's children in Iran that aren't able to get their medicines. There's people in Syria who don't have electricity. I've read now about food shortages and shortages of feminine hygiene products in Iran because they're unable to get around U.S. sanctions. And so all the people are suffering. People in Venezuela are dying. And so I know right now we're just looking at kind of the front end, or I guess maybe this is the back end of all this, kind of what's going on behind the scenes. But it is really important to really understand how all this works. So I don't know if you have anything else to add about it.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think that's one of the biggest problems that we face. Those of us who believe in a more non-interventionist foreign policy, our case is really hard to make because the consequences of it so often are hidden from us. If Americans had to see the impact of these things, if they had to see the starving children in Yemen, if they had to see the suffering of people in Iran, the starving people in Venezuela, there would be a lot more backlash. Just like during the Vietnam War, the fact that the news and the media showed the bodies and showed combat footage that was not sanitized, it galvanized the anti-war movement. We don't have that today. So all of this happens kind of in the dark. It becomes a policy debate. It becomes this kind of ethereal thing, and we forget that it's real, honest to goodness women, children, innocent people that are suffering because of these things. Human suffering on a scale that we can't even imagine. And, that's true of just the warfare in general. It was true of the drone wars. We have this idea of a video game, some guy sitting behind a screen and, there's a little blip and a bright flash of light. Well, under that bright flash of light's some poor woman and her kids that just got obliterated from the face of the earth. And I think it's important to try to realize that and to try to communicate it. I did want to touch on one thing real quick that I found actually subsequent to all of this research. It's interesting because the United States is starting to go to more of an individualized sanction regime. So instead of, or in addition to sanctioning an entire country, they can actually sanction individuals and they can lock people out of the economic system. So, some guy's designated a bad guy in Africa. Well, they can lock him out of the economic system. They can freeze his assets. They can do all kinds of crazy things like that. And that has ramifications as well on the whole SWIFT thing. And I actually found this article on, it's in the EU Observer, and it's talking about, this kind of move to individualized sanctions and target individuals. And, they're kind of making an argument that, hey, this could be good because it could be used to kind of pinpoint sanctions at bad individuals. But then it says this, it says, let me find this. Oh, here it is. It could also lead to U.S. sanctions against EU bank CEOs who are board members of SWIFT, a Belgium-based firm that handles international bank transfers, if Europe refused to lock Iran out of SWIFT's network. So, there again, you see the reality of what I was talking about on RT that the Voice of America is trying to tell us doesn't happen. This is how they can do it without even having to influence, SWIFT as an organization. All they have to do is go to individual board members and say, you know what, you better toe the line here, or we're going to freeze all your bank accounts and you're not going to be able to do business anywhere. Well, I don't know about you, but if I'm in that position, that's going to have a little bit of influence over how I behave. So, anybody who thinks that the U.S. isn't doing this, that believes the propaganda is, not too bright, just to be nice. So, yeah, I think this is something that I'm definitely going to try to keep tabs on because it's not something that's often reported, and it's kind of in my wheelhouse with the work I do with some of my other projects. So, it's been cool. It's been a learning experience from my end as well, and I'm just glad that there's a voice out there that's letting this information be known because, as they say, sunlight is the best antiseptic.
Yeah, so I want to add to this that the U.S. is starting to sanction like members of the Lebanon parliament and, different political leaders in Iran. And one thing that I've noticed is this is actually starting to freeze them out of like social networks and stuff like that. And so you could really start to think about how the U.S. could change a country's whole, democratic process for whatever that's worth, or different kinds of movements. If, the leadership of those movements can't get on Twitter and Facebook or whatever other social networks that I guess are U.S. or anywhere, Western based, it's really going to limit their ability to organize and stuff like that. I mean, I'm sure as the communications director of the 10th Amendment Center, you could kind of attest to how important like these social networks are to grassroots movements.
Yeah, and I think people should stop and consider, because I think you'll say that, and your average man on the street, your average woman on the street is going to say, well, the U.S. has good reasons to do that because these are bad people. And somebody once, I think it was Glenn Greenwald, he once said that the government's definition of bad people and your definition of bad people are two different things. The government's definition of bad people is anybody who opposes the policies of the government. So, by that definition, you and I are bad people. And all of these foreign policy things ultimately end up coming home. The war on terror, all of these surveillance and the militarization, you start seeing that in local police departments. It all ends up coming home. And these same type of sanctions, I guarantee you they're going to come home as well. And The government in the United States has a rich and luscious history of spying on and trying to subvert anti-war movements. There was some efforts with the Tea Party, Black Lives Matter. So no matter what side of the political spectrum you're on, you should be concerned that the government has the power to unperson you and to lock you out of these important platforms. And it's also an argument, to kind of go a different direction with it. It's also a good argument for decentralization. There's some folks that are working on some things with the blockchain that kind of decentralizes the flow of information, which I think really, really need to be developed because, when the government can just lock you out, then like you said, that's a very dangerous thing. And if you trust the government, then, yippee skippy for you. But I, for one, don't. And the government doesn't have a real good track record as far as being trustworthy.
Right. You would think with the huge percentage of Americans that are terrified that Donald Trump is, somehow equivalent to, a near Hitler status. I think we've kind of finally backed off the Trump is Hitler, but they call the ICE detention facilities concentration camps. So I suppose so. You would think all those people would absolutely agree with that, well, we definitely need decentralization because, whoever like Donald Trump is sanctioning people in the Arab world. Do you think that the supreme racist is going to be doing that in a way that only the bad people are, kept off of social media? You would think that, I don't know. I just imagined that when Trump got elected president, like 30% of the population that believed, the Trump is absolutely evil narrative would instantly become libertarians, and they would say, oh my God, this crazy guy has so much power. So I guess this is a good transition to the 10th Amendment Center. And I want to give you an opportunity to just talk about all the great work that you're doing there. And, I think you have one issue in particular that you want to focus on.
Well, actually, I'm going to jump off of what you said because you just made a really, really interesting point. And I've actually seen that dynamic. Now, maybe not to the degree that you would like. And obviously, we don't have a bunch of lefties turning into rabid libertarians. But there has been a definite shift in politics in terms of who is in favor of decentralization and efforts to roll back centralized power and who isn't. During the Obama years, it was the Tea Party people, it was the Trump supporters, it was the American right who were the big supporters of the work that we're doing at the 10th Amendment Center. If people aren't familiar with what we're doing in a nutshell, we adhere to constitutional originalism, which basically is a very limited federal government with most of the powers remaining with the states and local governments. So it's a decentralized system. Washington, D.C. was really only intended to deal with things like foreign policy, foreign trade. It was a outward face to the world. Most of the internal things, healthcare, education, all of these things that the federal government is involved in now were never meant to be taken care of at the federal level. So during the Obama years, everybody was on board. They wanted to get rid of Obamacare and they wanted to roll back the surveillance state because, Obama's going to spy on us and they're using the IRS against the Tea Party. And so all of the right was all for decentralization and everybody on the left was calling us racists. So, that's basically was how it worked. Now we're actually seeing a lot of interest from folks on the left in rolling back federal power. Now, they're not turning into what we would call tenthers or anything like that, but they're much more open to it. We see this with the issue of sanctuary cities where local jurisdictions are choosing not to cooperate with immigration enforcement. Now, no matter what you think about immigration enforcement, that is the right of a locality to make those decisions for themselves. We're seeing a lot more interest from the left on rolling back the surveillance state, dealing with police militarization, even to some degree, some economic kind of stuff as far as the central bank goes. People on the right, they're now sending me nasty emails and criticizing me every time that I say anything about the Trump administration. The Trump administration has been just as bad as far as constitutional fidelity as the Obama administration was. I mean, just as one example, Donald Trump is worse on gun control than Barack Obama. Donald Trump actually banned bump stocks. Now, Obama talked a lot about gun control, but he never actually did gun control. Trump has done gun control. So But if I mention that, you're just trying to criticize Trump. Where were you when Obama did? Well, I was right here saying the same thing, buddy. So it is interesting to see the way this political shift has happened. Now, I guarantee you, if a Democrat wins in 2020, it'll flip back again, and I will start getting the emails from the left about how I'm a racist and I support slavery, and all of the people on the right who are the big Trump supporters now, they're going to be all gung ho for it. My position is follow the Constitution, every issue, every time, no exceptions, no excuses. No matter who's in power, we follow the limits on the federal government, and that goes everything from, like I've mentioned, surveillance, from economic policy, education. All of this stuff should be at the state level. And even when it comes to foreign policy, the U.S. foreign policy is largely unconstitutional. When was the last time we had a declaration of war? 1941 to be exact. So all of these military interventions that have happened have been unconstitutional. You can argue about, they have the War Powers Act. Well, that's unconstitutional too. There's no constitutional authority for Congress to basically give its power to the president. That was never the intention. So that's what we're all about at the 10th Amendment Center. And it's very interesting the way the political dynamics shift back and forth. And I think the whole red team, blue team thing is stupid. To me, the biggest threat to our liberty is centralized power. So we should oppose it no matter who is in control of it. And I tell people this all the time. You always have to remember, whatever power that you give any kind of government to do something that you want it to do, at some point, that power is going to be turned against you. At some point, there is going to be a person holding that position that you're not going to like. So somebody said this once, and I think it's a pretty good illustration and kind of funny. You should imagine that you never want to give the government a power that you wouldn't want to give your ex-wife. And I like that because it's true. The power is the problem. The holder of that power is going to change. So people need to think really, really closely. And you would think that the left would have learned that lesson after cheerleading all of the constitutional overreach and all of the centralization of power that Obama did. And then all of a sudden Trump has it, and then we had the whole freak out on the left. And now we've got the exact opposite going on. We've got the people on the right who should know better cheerleading this consolidation of power in the executive branch and the profligate spending and the $22 trillion of debt and the record deficits. And, this is all right because this is our guy and he's playing 4D chess. Well, you're an idiot because at some point, the Democrats are going to be back in control and they're going to have every ounce of power that you let Trump get away with. So, that's the end of that rant.
Yeah, well, I guess another part of this whole thing with you going on RT is that, and with the political shift, one of the most disappointing things about the election was, the Russiagate narrative emerging, and then you really lost like a huge chunk of the people who should have now kind of been good on things, wasting all their time on this stupid fake, Russiagate scandal. And that I'm sure adds to the reason why Nit Sarwart says you shouldn't have gone on that network, and Polygraph.Info, went out and tried to attack you on it, is because of all, this anti-Russia crap that happened because nobody could accept that Hillary Clinton was just never going to be president of the United States because she's a terrible person. And even a fool like Donald Trump was able to beat her because she just has such an awful, awful record. And I don't know. I just thought it was worth mentioning that. I think that has a lot to do with why you were attacked from a couple different sides on this, is the, invention of this Russiagate narrative, and then that really hurting people who could be good on this. I'm sure Rachel Maddow probably would have done some good investigative reporting if she didn't waste all of her time on fake Russiagate.
Have you remember back when there was an anti-war left? Man, those were good times. You remember the big, massive anti-war movement when the U.S. initially invaded Iraq? I mean, that was largely driven by the left. And boy, when Barack Obama got elected, that went away, poof. And I kind of hoped that, my initial hope was that Trump would turn out to be as non-interventionist as he kind of seemed when he was campaigning. Kind of didn't believe that was going to happen, but, one can hope, right? But I at least hoped that once he revealed that he was going to continue things pretty much status quo, when he went in and bombed Syria, when he started saber rattling with Iran, that maybe the left just by virtue of, they would come back to because it was a Republican. But no, the Russiagate thing is more important because they think that's a better way to get at the president. And, there's no principle. There's no principle in politics whatsoever. And, I guess we shouldn't expect it. It's a bunch of sociopaths and people who want power, wrestling with each other. But, it is pretty sad. And I will give kudos to those folks that are on the left. And I know some of them who have been consistently anti-war, no matter who's in power, that criticized, people like Obama and his minions when he was running the drone war. Those folks are out there, and I appreciate them. But somewhere we need a real anti-war movement to reemerge, and it's not going to happen in the Democratic Party, that's for sure. Because I think we talked about this a little bit in the last episode, the way that they're unpersoning Tulsi Gabbard, just like they unpersoned Ron Paul. If you're against the foreign policy establishment, then you're going to get unpersoned and ignored and turned into a villain. And that's a sad thing because, like we said earlier, this is about real human lives, not just policy. And it's sad that people will trade human lives for political power. But I guess that's the sad world we live in, man.
Well, I will say one little hope of optimism I had with the Democrats in the past week was apparently there's this group of younger Jewish Americans going around with their smartphones because now everybody could be a journalist, and they're putting their camera in Dems' faces, the candidates' faces, and they're saying, do you support the occupation of Palestine? And really just, confronting the candidates with the questions that the mainstream media would ever refuse to ask. And so now you do have, I think, Joe Biden giving some, wild mush mouth answers like, oh, well, we worked really hard on this under the Obama administration, but blah, blah, blah. At the end of the day, they do have to kind of, in a yes or no sense, give the idea that they don't support the occupation. And you have now Cory Booker on camera saying that, hey, if you, believe that the Palestinians are human beings and, should have rights to not live in an open air prison, then, don't support me. Because I am not that candidate. I am in no way humanitarian whatsoever and don't care about their lives whatsoever. So if that's what you believe, don't support me. And that's great that we have that on camera now. Yeah. So I don't know. I think that kind of activism is important. I'm sure, at the 10th Amendment Center, you're doing a whole bunch of stuff, but why don't you take the time, whatever issue that is either, maybe coming up soon. I think you said that summer isn't like key, legislation session time. But anything like one issue that you want to tell my audience, like, hey, go out there and support this at, your local or state level.
Well, yeah, you're right. This time of year, as far as our actual activism work, it is pretty slow. Most of the state legislatures are not in session, and that's the bulk of our work is in state legislators. And basically what we're trying to do, for people who might not be familiar, is we use the power of states to undermine overreaching federal power. And it's primarily through non-cooperation. We have this legal precedent, and it's rooted in the Constitution, that the federal government cannot force a state or a local government to implement a federal program or enforce a federal law. So they can't force the state to use its resources or its personnel. And so that gives the states a great deal of power, and that's why marijuana legalization has worked. When the state quits enforcing marijuana laws, 99% of marijuana arrests happen under state law. So when you get rid of the state law, that gets rid of the basis for like most of the arrests. The federal government simply doesn't have the personnel and resources to enforce all of its laws or to implement all of its programs. So when the states simply don't do it, then you have a great deal of power, and it just doesn't get done, quite frankly. I've said this for a long time. People don't oppose sanctuary cities because they don't work. They oppose sanctuary cities because they do work. The federal government needs that cooperation. So we try to use that model within a variety of issues. Everything from healthcare to gun control to surveillance to police militarization, asset forfeiture, all of these things that the federal government does in partnership with state and local governments. When we can get state and local governments to quit, then it has a huge impact on the federal government. And so that's the kind of work that we do. like I said, this time of year, we do a lot more teaching, a lot more writing. We're working on some video projects, trying to catch up from the session last year, some laws going into effect. The one thing I did want to call to the attention of your audience, and I think this dovetails into the foreign policy issues, is an interesting article that came out. I guess it's been 2 weeks ago or so. It was a Washington Post article, but they were reporting on some data that was gathered up. I think it was George Mason University, if I'm not mistaken, on the fact that the federal government, the FBI, and other federal law enforcement agencies are using state driver's license as the photos for facial recognition. So in other words, they'll have a person that they're trying to find, and they'll actually go into a state's driver's license database and compare photos with the picture of the person they're looking for to try to identify that person. So basically what this does is it puts every American, if you have a driver's license, in a perpetual police lineup. It makes you a suspect all the time. And of course, this is problematic because facial recognition technology is not particularly accurate. It's even worse if you're a minority. It doesn't read minority features very well. And so it was interesting because this report came out, Washington Post reported on it, and there was this big hue and cry. Everybody, it was good because there was actually some negative reaction against the surveillance state. There was a lot of people that were really concerned, that didn't like the idea of every driver's license picture in the United States being part of a police lineup. And we had some congressmen, going out there and saying this is bad and this shouldn't be going on, and the outrage. Here's the sad thing about it, though. Basically, this same information came out from the same people about 3 years ago. And so we already had this hue and cry. 3 years later, nobody's done anything about it. And that's the problem with Washington, D.C. That's the problem with Congress. They talk a lot. They don't do crap. And if you really want to roll back federal power, the most useless thing that you can do is call the 202 area code and beg some congressman to roll back their own power. It's not going to happen. That's why we take this state and local approach at the 10th Amendment Center. It's not that state and local governments are good, because they're not. They suck too. But the fact of the matter is we have a lot more leverage over a state government and even more leverage over a local government through activism than we do at the national level. So when it comes to surveillance, yes, we should be outraged that the FBI is doing this, but we're not going to get Congress to ever pass a law to prohibit them from doing this. But what we can do is we can get states to deny access to their driver's license databases without a warrant. That's a much easier sell than trying to get Congress to do something. So that's the kind of work that we're doing on surveillance. We're trying to limit surveillance at the state and local level, because all of the information that they're gathering with license plate readers, with stingray devices, with cameras, with facial recognition technology, all of that information gets gathered up and passed on to the federal government and dumped into these giant databases. If the state and local governments aren't gathering this stuff, then it's not there to be put into the federal databases in the first place. So warrant requirements, limitations, restrictions. There's some great things going on with facial recognition. San Francisco actually just banned facial recognition technology in the city. There was another city, I believe it was Somerville, Massachusetts, that has also put a moratorium on the use of facial recognition. There's a bill that was introduced in the Michigan legislature at the state level to ban facial recognition, because it's not accurate and it's creepy. When the government can watch everything that you do, when they can use facial recognition cameras and basically track you from place to place, follow you around. I mean, Big Brother would have drooled over this stuff. And for everybody out there, and probably in your audience, there's not a lot of this, but when you get out like on a regular radio show and start talking about surveillance, you get the person that's going to go, well, Mike, if you don't have anything to hide, you got nothing to fear, which is just dumb. And I issue this challenge to anybody who thinks that. Go on your web browser, and you can actually get in there and you can download all your browsing history. So download all of your browsing history for the last year. Don't delete anything. No. Complete web browsing history. You can email it to me at michaelmaharrey.com, and I'll put it on my website. So that's the challenge for you who don't have anything to hide, because, if you don't have anything to hide, you have nothing to fear. That's ridiculous. Of course you have something to hide. We all value our privacy. We have curtains on our windows for a reason. Privacy is a basic element of self-ownership. If you believe in self-ownership, then you believe in privacy, and government should not be able to violate your privacy without having a really high standard to meet. And, I want to look at a driver's license photo is not that standard. So, so we need to end this surveillance state, and we're going to do it from the bottom up, not from the top down. So, check out 10thamendmentcenter.com. You spell out 10th, and you'll see what's going on. Right now, if you check out our blog, you'll see a lot of laws that are going into effect that were passed in the 2019 session. A lot of laws this year were passed, a lot of good things that will push back against federal power and will expand our liberty, at least to a small degree. And we appreciate everybody supporting us. If you like the work that we're doing, you can be a member at the 10th Amendment Center for as little as like $2 a month. I mean, what a great investment. I think we're doing work that is valuable. And, there's a lot of organizations out there, a lot of think tanks that put out a lot of papers, but there's not a lot of people that are actually doing stuff where you can point to it and say, hey, these guys were helped get this thing passed that actually put a limit on government power. And we do that every day of the week, and, toot my own horn a little bit, but I think we do good work, and we definitely appreciate all the folks that support us.
Yeah, I just want to say to anybody who maybe can't imagine even their little old grandma having anything offensive in their web browser, that you point out that this facial recognition is bad, and it's bad. It does not work. And you have cops like this one in Florida who just planted drugs on random people.
Yep.
And so even if your little old grandma actually has nothing to hide, if some poor working facial recognition software accidentally flags her, and then some terrible cop pulls her over and puts meth in her purse, then it's the cop's word versus your grandmother's, who, is just going to be framed as some meth user. So of course she's lying.
Yep.
And
I'll give you another example, and this is not facial recognition. It's license plate reading technology, but it's in the same category. This is a true story out of Kansas. Some cops there decided that they needed to go after the marijuana growers in the area. So they decided a good way to find them would be to set up a license plate reader at this store that sold like indoor grow lights and greenhouse equipment, because, obviously if you're growing weed inside, then you need those big lights, and you need the hydroponic kind of stuff. And so they actually set a license plate reader up by this store. It recorded every license plate, every driver that went in and out. And then they went and they went through all of that information, and then they tried to find some associations, and, they used that as the beginning point of the investigation. Well, this one poor dude, one night, he's at home, with his wife and kids. There's a banging on the door. The next thing he knows, there's a SWAT team in his living room. He's being held at gunpoint. His wife is freaking out. His kids are freaking out. His wife actually ended up having some PTSD issues from this. And lo and behold, our fine police officers, you know what they found? You know what they protected us from? Tomatoes. Yep. He had bought this stuff in order to grow tomatoes in his basement. That's all he'd ever done. He just happened to have some associations with some people that they thought might be, nefarious. They were, not relevant to the investigation, but just because he was in that place at that time, they used that technology in order to build a case on this guy. And, you think about it, when a SWAT team comes into your house, guns pointed, you're a trigger finger away from dead. And this is not necessarily an unusual thing. We see this kind of stuff happening all the time with this type of surveillance technology. I'm not saying that it should never be used. I understand that that's unreasonable in this day and age. Law enforcement can use it for legitimate purposes, but there darn sure needs to be oversight. There needs to be transparency, and there needs to be absolute warrant requirements that are set in stone. If they're not, you're going to end up with grandma going to jail with meth in her purse, and, some poor guy getting shot because he's protecting his tomato crop.
All right. Well, everybody, go check out the work that Mike and Mike Bolden are doing at the 10th Amendment Center. It's absolutely fantastic and essential. And, plug anything else you want to. I know you've written a couple books. You're the host of 3 podcasts now. And of course, and I think your most important role is at the 10th Amendment Center as communications director.
Yeah, if everybody goes to one place based off this show, please do visit 10thamendmentcenter.com and check out the work that we're doing there. I think it's just, even if you're like, I tell this even to people who are like anarchists and don't really like to get politically involved. What we're doing is undermining government power. And, I think from a pragmatic standpoint, I think the work that we're doing speaks for itself. And it's also, I call it the gateway drug to liberty. It was my pathway into liberty, the whole idea of limited government. Eventually you realize that limited government's a farce. But this is a step that people, your average person out there who, is not grounded in libertarian philosophy or whatever, that they can grasp, wrap their head around and begin to see the problem of overreach and how it can be struck down through nullification, through non-cooperation. So I think it's just an important, very important work. And, thank goodness for Michael Bolden, who had the foresight way back in 2006 to start this organization. So visit that. If you want to check out some of the stuff that I'm doing, you can go to michaelmaharrey.com. That's where my podcast, Thoughts from a Hairy Head, is hosted. I talk about political decentralization and constitutional issues on that. You can find my books. My main book is called Our Last Hope, Rediscovering the Lost Path of Liberty, which explains this whole concept of nullification from a philosophical, historical, and pragmatic standpoint. So that's there. Other stuff on michaelmaharrey.com. You can listen to my music or check out Constitution 101 if you want to learn about the Constitution. And then if you're a Christian and you're interested in how Christianity intersects with voluntarism and libertarian anarchism, you can check out my website, godarchy.org, which is kind of a side project, which I know doesn't really make sense in the context of the 10th Amendment Center, but just go with me on it. So those are the main things. I'm on Twitter, Maharrey10th, but my Twitter game is lame. And if you're interested in economics and particularly precious metals, I do work for Shift Gold, and I do a podcast for them every week called the Friday Gold Wrap, where I talk about the week's economic and precious metals news. It's about an 11-minute podcast that just kind of goes over some of the stuff that's going on with the Federal Reserve, with the markets, and some of this global stuff too. I'll get into SWIFT and some of those things as well. So that's over at shiftgold.com /news. You can find all that stuff there. I think that's it.
All right. Yeah, you are one of the busiest men in the libertarian movement. So thank you for all that you do. And thank you for your service. So that's the way we'll end this show. I'll talk to you later, Mike.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me again, man.